It was dusk as our airplane that was to deliver me to a Soviet prison camp approached Moscow. I could not help remembering, as I looked at the city from the air, how tantalizingly close we had come to capturing it in December 1941. I remembered thinking when I was wounded just outside of Moscow that I would miss the victory parade in front of the Kremlin. How ironic that thought seemed now. I thought also of the many brave soldiers, German and Russian, who lay buried in the earth over which we flew. When our airplane touched down on a runway south of Moscow, there were no buildings, just some runways. A Russian officer with an American jeep, a driver and a guard, met the airplane to take me to what apparently would be my final destination. With gestures, the officer ordered me into the jeep beside the driver, and he and the guard sat in the back seat. Darkness rapidly descended as we drove north, through Moscow, to a prison camp. At the camp, we drove through a wooden gate that was opened for us by a guard with a submachine gun hanging from his shoulder. A sign over the gate said Krasnogorsk 2711. The numbers seemed to indicate that there were other Krasnogorsk prison camps. My escort officer went into a building next to the gate while I waited with the guard. Beyond the entrance gate, I could see 2 barbed wire fences with a 3-meter death strip of raked sand between them. The fences were about 4 meters high, crowned with 10-meter-high wooden watchtowers at 30-meter intervals. I had seen this type of fence 4 years earlier at the Russian-Polish border. Finally, my escort officer returned with another officer, who signalled me to follow him. In the darkness, I could barely make out several wooden barracks as we walked along a gravel street to a gate in another board fence. The guard, who had followed us, unlocked the gate, and the Russian officer and I entered the fenced-in area. Inside the board fence was another barrack, like the ones we had just passed. The Russian officer led me into it and pointed at an empty bunk, which I interpreted as an invitation to settle down there. One lonely bulb hanging near the entrance cast light into an aisle formed by 2 rows of built-in double bunks, some of them occupied by sleeping forms. I had only my fur-lined uniform overcoat, my canteen, and a small army-issue food bag that attached to the belt. We had used it to carry food in when we were in combat. I deposited my meagre possessions at the foot of the bunk and fell wearily into it, pulling my overcoat over me, more for security than for warmth, since it was summer. Sleep came quickly, but it was a very fitful sleep, full of apprehension and uncertainty about the future. I was certain they would shoot me after they had learned everything I could tell them. When I woke the next morning, I was relieved to find that the barrack contained about 15 German officers. I introduced myself to everyone, and someone went to a designated place and brought back food for all of us. I was handed a watery bowl of cabbage soup with a tiny fish floating in it and some extremely weak imitation coffee. I was repulsed by the sight and the smell of the soup. It had a strong, unpleasant fish odour. As a small child, I had been deathly ill after eating fish, and I had never eaten fish again. "Is there nothing else?" I asked. "This is it," an oberst responded, smiling wryly. "In a few days you will be glad to get it." "What do you get at other meals?" I asked. "They are identical to this one. Other than that, we just get 300 grams of bread each day." So all that stood between me and starvation was this putrid cabbage soup and a little bread each day. I could not know what was in store for me, whether I would be shot after the Russians had everything they wanted from me, whether I would spend the rest of my life in Russian captivity, or whether I would eventually go home. But it was obvious that the only thing I could control now was how I handled myself in this new situation. I decided that I would do everything in my power to stay alive and as healthy as possible, and hope to eventually return to my family. I took my meagre portion of the fish soup and ate it, trying hard not to smell it. I swallowed the tiny fish whole. I exchanged a little small talk with my fellow prisoners and learned that I was in a quarantine barrack and would stay here for 3 weeks. All of the other people in the barrack were senior officers, majors, Oberstleutnants and Obersts, except for one Oberleutnant. His name was Kurt von Berkersrode, and I'd had a von Berkersrode in my regiment when I was stationed at Plauen. "He is my older brother, Friedrich," the Oberleutnant told me when I asked. "He is in the main camp here, according to the Russians, and they are bringing me here from a labour camp to join him. I do not know why they are being so kind, but I am more than happy to take advantage of it." The younger von Berkersrode was perhaps 23 years old and very thin, almost emaciated. It was good to know that I would have at least one acquaintance in the main camp. I had not known the older von Berkersrode well, since he had been at Altenburg and I had been at Plauen, but I remembered him from the meetings of all regiment officers. After breakfast, I wandered outside the barrack, where the bright June sun made the world look cheerful in spite of my unhappy circumstances. The quarantine barrack was the only thing inside the board fence that surrounded it. I could not see very much of the rest of the camp. I noticed an older man tending some flowers that had been planted beside the fence. He wore Bavarian short leather pants and the traditional Bavarian hat, complete with feather. He looked vaguely familiar to me, and then I realized that it was General Feldmarschall Schörner in civilian clothes. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me for a moment, then said, "Don't I know you?" "Jawohl, Herr General Feldmarschall," I responded. "You sent me to Breslau in January to help get it ready for siege." "Yes, Breslau," he said, nodding. "I remember. Were you captured there?" "No, I surrendered in Berlin. I was operations officer of the 56th Panzer Corps under General Weidling." "Oh, yes," he said. "Well, the Russians did not capture me. My army group and I fought our way through from Czechoslovakia to the west and surrendered to the Americans. However, the Americans just turned us over to the Russians anyway, so it was all for nothing. If I had known the Americans would do that, I would not have sacrificed the lives that it cost to fight our way through to the west." He heaved a heavy sigh and looked down at the ground. "You might as well know that inside the main camp here, I am being criticized for continuing to fight after the formal surrender so I could get my army group to the west. They are saying that I sacrificed German lives unnecessarily. In view of what eventually happened, of course, they are right." It seemed important to him that I understand his motives for continuing to fight after the surrender. He said he had also wanted to give German civilians a chance to get to the west, and many civilians had in fact escaped the Russians with his army group. Schörner was known to German soldiers as the hangman, because of his order during the fighting at the end that any soldier found behind the lines without proper orders to be there should be court-martialed and hanged if found guilty of desertion. The Russians must have resented Schörner's continuing to fight and kill Russian soldiers after the surrender, and his taking his army group to the west to surrender, but they apparently were giving him special treatment for some reason. They kept him in the relatively spacious prison camp instead of in a cramped cell at Lubyanka or Butyrka prison, where they kept other high-ranking German generals. For the rest of my 3 weeks in the quarantine barrack, I saw very little of Schörner, which led me to believe that he must have a room of his own somewhere. Some of the other prisoners in the quarantine barrack had been in other prison camps, and I learned from them a little about life in Russian captivity. "Be thankful you are here," the younger von Berkersrode told me. "At the labour camp I was in, the Russians routinely starved and worked German prisoners to death." His description of the labour camps did not paint a pretty picture. The depression that takes over the human soul in a climate with 4 months of darkness, the 16-hour workdays and 7-day work weeks, the physical weakness that comes with being overworked on an inadequate diet, the brutality of the Russian guards. He told of gold crowns being broken off the teeth of live German prisoners by the Russian guards, of having to carry the dead out of the camp in wheelbarrows and bury them without ceremony. In the following days, whenever I found myself getting depressed about my situation, I would seek out Berkersrode and find some solace in the fact that I was here rather than in the hellish labour camps he described so vividly. During the 3 weeks I was in quarantine, our number remained steady at about 15, although people would be released into the main camp and others would arrive, usually from Germany, but occasionally from another prison camp. Krasnogorsk. Prison Camp 27-11 was just outside Moscow, about 22 kilometers from the Kremlin, which made it convenient for NKVD, later KGB, interrogators. Apparently, the Russians kept people they wanted to interrogate frequently, like Weidling and von Dufing in Lubyanka or Butyrka prison in Moscow, and those they wanted to interrogate less frequently at Krasnogorsk. To my surprise, I learned that the main camp was actually run by Germans called activists, who were collaborating with the Russians. I learned that the tower guards, the NKVD interrogators, and the camp commander, who counted all prisoners twice each day, were likely to be the only Russians I would ever see. I could see some of the camp from the quarantine barrack. It consisted of a number of buildings on each side of a gravel street. Although most of the buildings were barracks, others included an administration building, a large assembly hall that I later learned was used for propaganda films and events, a latrine, a bathhouse, a small dispensary, a kitchen, and a laundry. The camp was surrounded by the barbed wire fences I had seen on my arrival, the strands of which were so close together that nothing could get between them. The death strip between the two fences was lighted with floodlights at night and kept raked so that a footprint would show clearly. I was told that a few attempts to escape had been made, but those prisoners who did escape had always been caught, and then they were badly beaten and kept in solitary confinement for weeks. Even if a prisoner succeeded in getting out of the camp, he would be over 1,000 kilometers from another country. I later heard that some German prisoners had escaped from other camps and had actually got out of Russia. One was supposedly a German doctor who escaped with the help of a female Russian doctor. The story was that she did all the talking and he played deaf and dumb. I suspected that this story was just a fantasy kept alive by desperate prisoners. The days passed slowly in the quarantine barrack. We shared our stories with one another, but 15 stories are not long in the telling. We could walk around the barrack, but the fence was no more than 5 meters from the building, so our walking route was cramped and provided little outlet for the tension of being inactive and captive. Oberleutnant von Berkes-Roda revelled in being able to get enough sleep, which he had apparently not been able to do since surrendering at Stalingrad 2.5 years ago. But for me, it was difficult to go suddenly from a life of constant action, of helping to command divisions, to a life of absolute inactivity, without a say in even something as insignificant as when I would eat. Time, of which there had never previously been enough, seemed suddenly to be the only commodity remaining in my life. I found it difficult to believe how slowly it passed, and the more conscious I was of it, the more its passage seemed to slow. Inactivity and restlessness were obviously enemies I would have to conquer. As bad as the food was, and it never varied in quality or quantity, mealtimes were at least events that helped break up the day. Hunger was a serious factor we all had to deal with from our first day in captivity. Each of us was left immersed in his own thoughts most of the time. Lilo and Klaus and our unborn child were always on my mind. I could not know whether they had survived the war, but my mother had told me on the telephone that the Americans were taking Leipzig instead of the Russians, and I tried to focus on that fact. It meant that their chances were good. But even if they had survived, how would they live? I tried hard to put them out of my mind, but I could not. Losing the war also preyed on my mind. Being captured had always been a real possibility for all of us, but surrendering our country... I felt stunned now, almost as if I were in someone else's bad dream. The war had shattered my life and left only a deep void. Home and a normal life were things I would probably never know again. I had to learn to adjust to our total defeat and my status as a prisoner of the Russians. It was a feeling of complete desperation. Germany was divided both geographically and ideologically, and it was unlikely ever to exist again as a whole nation. I spent much of those first 3 weeks going over Germany's experience of the previous 6 years. Where had we gone so wrong? I felt that Germany's claim to the Rhineland, the Sudetenland, and the Polish corridor had been justified because they had been taken away from us at the end of World War I by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler annexed Austria as a result of a plebiscite by the Austrian people. I felt that our invasion of France had been justified because France had declared war on us. Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands had not declared war on us, however, and yet we had gone through those countries to get to France. Occupying them had been just a matter of convenience. Obviously, in retrospect, that was wrong. We had done it during World War I, and we automatically did it again, and perhaps because we did it the first time, it seemed acceptable when we did it again. We had needed Norway for its raw materials and to protect our northern flank from England, but now that I had time to consider our actions, I had to concede that we had no right to invade and occupy Norway. It was only now beginning to dawn on me that our treatment of other nations had been arrogant, and that the only justification we had felt necessary was our own need. As for the Soviet Union, we had hated the concept of communism, and felt that the Soviet government was cruelly subjugating the Soviet people. But that hardly gave us the right to violate their sovereignty. Of course, we were not just fighting communism. The concept of Lebensraum, or living space, would have been our justification for annexing Ukraine for its food-producing capability and the Caucasus for its oil reserves. We had operated under a might makes right theory. As these things all went through my mind, I began to realize that I should have thought them through at the time of their occurrence, but I was a soldier, and a soldier does not question the orders of his superiors. I had unquestioningly accepted the brutal philosophy that might makes right. The arrogance of our national behaviour had not even occurred to me at the time. Although such blind obedience was probably the only military way to keep soldiers focused on the task at hand, the realization that I had allowed myself to become a non-thinking cog in Hitler's military machine depressed me now. What had begun, at least in our minds, as an effort to correct the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles had escalated far beyond anything that any of us could have imagined. In retrospect, I realized that I and countless others like me had helped Hitler start and fight a world war of conquest that had left tens of millions of people dead and destroyed our own country. I wondered now whether I would ever have questioned these things if we had won the war. I had to conclude that it was unlikely. This was a lesson taught by defeat, not by victory. After 3 endless weeks, I was finally released from quarantine and moved into the main camp. A German general major named Bammler met me at the camp's administration building and escorted me to my assigned barrack. Bammler was several inches taller than I, and perhaps 15 years older. As we walked from the administration building to the barrack, he glanced at my uniform. "You would be wise to remove the red stripes from your trousers," he said as we walked. I was surprised, because those red stripes were a badge of honour to a general or a general staff officer. I glanced down and only now realized that he had removed his own red stripes. "Why?" I asked. "Because the only purpose in wearing them is to set yourself apart as a member of an elite group, and there are no elite groups here." I did not respond, but I wondered why a German general would make such a statement. The general staff was indeed an elite group, and one that took much pride in being elite. I did not pursue the subject with him at that moment, but in the ensuing days, one German activist or another would make a point of attacking me verbally until I finally removed the red stripes so I could have some peace. When I moved into my assigned bunk, I introduced myself to my neighbours, and we exchanged our stories. I looked for Oberleutnant von Birkersrode and found him in my own barrack. He introduced me to his brother, Friedrich, who remembered me from 1938, when we had served in the same regiment. His unit had surrendered to the Russians in the Crimea during the summer of 1943, and he had now been in this camp 2 years. We were to become very good friends. He told me that General Bammler was cooperating with the Russians in return for more food and better treatment, and cautioned me to be very careful what I said to Bammler or to anyone else whom I did not know extremely well. I began to watch the people around me carefully. Slowly, during the days and weeks that followed, I learned more about them, not so much from what they told me as from the way they conducted themselves. I learned that how they were reacting to what was happening to them now was more important than what they had been or done in the past. I was now able to get a closer look at the camp. Each barrack was a long, narrow building, about 10 metres wide and 24 metres long. 2 aisles ran through each barrack, with a row of bunks on each side of each aisle, and wood-burning stoves at opposite ends of each aisle, although the stoves were not being used in June. In one corner of each barrack was a separate small room for the German activist who was supervising the barrack for the Russians. We slept on board bunks that were in 3 tiers. The bunks were built for 2 men, but at times over the years we were so crowded that 6 men had to sleep in a space built for 2. When that happened, we could not turn over at night unless we all turned over at the same time. We had straw bags for mattresses. The German army used the same kind of straw bag mattresses, but ours were fuller. A small, crude table and a window separated each set of bunks. The tables had no chairs, but we could sit on the lower tier of bunks. The barracks were dimly lit, with only 4 electric bulbs hanging from the ceiling, 2 over each aisle. The first order of business each day at 6 a.m. was to be counted. The Russian camp commander, the equivalent of a Hauptmann, counted us twice a day, accompanied by a non-commissioned officer. He would say, in Russian, "Prisoners of war, good morning," and we had to answer, also in Russian, "Good morning." Then he counted us. If the number came out right at each barrack, we could go to breakfast. If not, he would count us again. The Hauptmann was a stocky, peasant-looking type of person, sort of a Nikita Khrushchev without intelligence. The Russians must have put their least capable officers in charge of the prison camps, because most of them were really dumb, sometimes even. Counting on their fingers. They surely had people with more intelligence than that. In the summer, we were counted outside in the camp street. We stood in military formation, in rows of 3, in front of our barracks, and the camp commander would come through with a small wooden board, count us, and write the number on the board. No effort was made to identify us. Then he would do the same with the other barracks. In the winter, we stayed in the barracks for counting if it was unbearably cold outside. Sometimes the counting was fast, and sometimes it took up to an hour. If there was an announcement to be made, the camp commander would make it in Russian after completing the count, and then a Russian-speaking German activist would translate. An activist would then read us the news the Russians wanted us to have slanted and carefully edited bulletins that were of value to us only if we read between the lines. Sometimes the news they gave us would inadvertently indicate that they were having trouble with the Western nations. When their relationship with the West deteriorated, their treatment of us deteriorated. When their relationship with the West improved, their treatment of us improved. After the news, we would have breakfast. In each barrack bunk compartment, usually 12 to 18 people, the members took turns going to the kitchen, getting the food for the group, and bringing it back. Each group designated an especially trusted member to be the food master, whose function was to divide the food into equal portions. If any was left over, the food master kept a list of who had received seconds last, and the extra was distributed fairly in this manner. Our food master was Hauptmann Pawelek, a former judge from Bremen. After breakfast in our bunk area each day, we went to an open shed that had a metal water pipe running through the centre of it. Water would squirt out of holes in the pipe and into a wooden trough underneath. We would stand there, a row of 10 of us on each side of the pipe, and wash from the waist up in the cold water. The water was then turned off and we brushed our teeth. Those who had not brought toothbrushes into captivity used their fingers, and then the water was turned on again briefly. I had taken a comb and a toothbrush to the camp with me, but of course there was no toothpaste. Then we filed out and the next group came in. The latrine was a board with 12 holes over a large pit that was emptied every 2 weeks. It was open except from behind, so in the winter it was quite cold. The latrine was located 100 metres or so from the barracks, and chemicals were applied to it regularly to reduce the odour. During the evenings, the Russians often played Radio Moscow for us over a loudspeaker in the barracks. We got a lot of good classical music that way, which I enjoyed very much. For me, the music quickened the passage of time. I am sure the Russians did it as part of their effort to keep us docile. The Russians loved music and even allowed us to have a band. It played more for the Russians than for us, but we had concerts occasionally. One day in late 1945, quite unexpectedly, I found myself face to face with Major Wolf. He was as surprised as I was to find an old friend in Russian captivity. It was the most pleasant thing that had happened to me since I left Germany. I learned that after I had left him at the gravel quarry prison, he had become extremely ill, so ill that even the Russians took pity on him and sent him to a hospital. He spent several weeks in the hospital, and before he left, he had fallen in love with a German nurse. I was extremely glad to have my old friend around, and was soon able to get him a bunk in my barrack. We fell into our comfortable old relationship as colleagues and friends, although I almost wished he had not fallen in love with the nurse at the hospital in Berlin, because now he just had someone else to worry about, and he fretted about her constantly. The camp contained prisoners from all the European countries: Bulgarians, Romanians, Czechs, Poles, Austrians, Hungarians, Italians, people from every country that had fought as a German ally. Even though Spain had been neutral in the war, we had some Spaniards, because Spain had sent a division of volunteers to fight for Germany in reciprocation for our helping Franco in the Spanish Civil War. Of course, the great bulk of the prisoners were German. From 10 to 15% of the population of the camp were junior officers, under the rank of major, who were there because of their noble or famous names. About 5% were civilians and enlisted men who were there for the same reason, and 80 to 85% were senior officers, major and higher. The German military hierarchy was generally maintained in the camp. We did not wear insignia of rank or use titles of rank, but everyone knew everyone's rank, and the majority of us remained in the same relationship with one another. I discovered quickly that Krasnogorsk was populated by very interesting people. The Russians had congregated in the camp some of the outstanding military and civilian people from all over Europe and Asia: scientists, scholars, diplomats, artists, generals, nobles, people the Russians found useful or interesting. I felt fortunate to be held captive with some of Germany's best and brightest, but it seemed to me to also make it more likely that the Russians would shoot us once they had what they wanted from us, because these were all people who could exercise great influence over our society at home. I learned that I was there because I had been Weidling's operations officer, and they wanted to piece together what had happened in Berlin, and especially in the Führer bunker. They also had Weidling, von Duving, Refior, and others who had been in Berlin at the end. In other words, it was only because of where I had been the last weeks of the war that I was in this camp instead of in a labour camp. The Russians found me interesting only because of my experience defending Berlin, and that was a fluke, because if we had not lost contact with the Ninth Army as we fell back to Berlin, Weidling would not have decided to go to the Führer bunker to get the big picture of what was happening, and Hitler would not have ordered us into the city to defend Berlin. I was finding it difficult to justify my luck during the entire war. I had to accept it as my destiny without feeling guilt. Guilt that I had gone home to hospitals and schools during the war when others had stayed at the front, guilt that I had lived when so many others had died, and guilt now that I was in a prison camp where I did not have to work when so many were being worked to death in slave labour camps. I concluded that the Russians brought people to Krasnogorsk either because the people had information they wanted, or because they hoped to recruit and train them and return them to Germany to spy and work for them. They thought anyone with a famous name would be especially influential back home, and their thinking was on a double track. If they brought them here, these people could not influence the people at home against them, and if they could recruit the people with famous names, they could send well-known Germans back home to influence people in their favour. A few people in the camp were there only because of their names. One, for example, was a man named Truman, who had operated a cigar store in Potsdam. The Russians had asked whether he was related to the American president, and he boasted that he probably was because his grandfather's brother had emigrated to the United States. His boasting won him a ticket to Krasnogorsk. Another was named Ackermann. His father had been an important German politician before World War I. He caught their attention because of his name, and they shipped him off to Krasnogorsk. Another was named Hugo Dörpfeld. His father, Wilhelm Dörpfeld, had been the director of the German Archaeological Institute in Athens and had assisted in the excavation of Olympia and Troy. He was at Krasnogorsk simply because the Russians recognized his father's name. He must have been in his 50s. He had been a pharmacist. Intelligent, mature and stable, he had adapted well to being the son of a famous man, and we all liked him. He would not have been a threat to the Russians. The Russians were fascinated with nobility, although they had killed or frightened away all their own. Probably 30% of the prisoners in the camp were from the German nobility. Most were generals or general staff officers, but there were also some civilians. A board fence had been erected at one part of the camp to block our view of some civilian prisoners, primarily the family of Polish Prince Radziwill. The Russians had brought Prince Radziwill to Krasnogorsk to prevent him from being an influence against them in post-war Poland. His family included 12 to 15 people who spanned 3 generations. They had one barrack-like building to themselves, and the Russians had built the wooden fence around it to provide them with privacy. They were obviously showing Prince Radziwill a great deal of deference. We knew about the Radziwill family through a Catholic priest who lived in our barrack and conducted mass for them. I do not know whether the Prince Radziwill, who later became an in-law to US President John F. Kennedy, was one of the prince's grandchildren in that camp. Another noble civilian was Count Schwerin. He was a widower whose very prominent family had large estates in Mecklenburg and Pomerania. Many members of his family had been government ministers, and one was finance minister under Hitler. He was one of the oldest people in the camp and one of the most dignified members of the nobility. He kept very much to himself. Although he was not naturally gregarious, he became a supportive friend to me. The Russians took him to Krasnogorsk because he had a famous name and was a rich landowner. They may also have known that his deceased wife had been a Russian princess who had emigrated to Germany after the Russian Revolution. I think the Russians wanted to hold people like Schwerin and Radziwill as hostages for whatever need might arise. Eventually, I knew most of the people in my barrack personally, perhaps half the people in the camp by name, and most of the people in the camp, usually around 600, by sight. I knew many of their stories and why they were at Krasnogorsk. I also knew, for the most part, who was cooperating with the Russians in return for extra food and who was not. Groups of friends formed quickly in the camp, composed of people who were drawn together by common cultural backgrounds and interests. The groups would vary in size from a half dozen to a dozen people. These were the people we bunked with and ate with. We got to know one another well, and we did not have to worry so much about being spied on by clandestine collaborators, in addition to the known activists. We would celebrate one another's birthdays and other holidays as a group. Wolf, of course, became a member of my group. I trusted him completely, and in our years of captivity, his natural affability and optimism helped a lot of people through this bleak time. Another good friend and confidant was Major Friedrich von Burkersrode. He was also friendly and affable, but more importantly, he was very steady and mature, exuding an aura of great strength of character. He was also very intelligent, and he inspired confidence in those around him. He was the sort of man anyone would like to have backing him in any endeavour. He had been a division adjutant and had been captured by female Russian soldiers, whom he described as considerably more cruel than the male soldiers. He was from an old noble family that had large landholdings before the war in what was now East Germany. Of course, they lost all their property under the Russian occupation. His younger brother Kurt was also part of our group. He was little more than skin and bones and looked much older than his years. After the war, the Russians started looking for certain people, especially nobility. When they found they had 2 brothers from a noble family in different camps, they brought them together. probably thinking that if they did that, the brothers might be more willing to cooperate with them. It did not work for them in this case, but it was a lucky break for Kurt. As an Oberleutnant, he had to work at Krasnogorsk, but life was much easier for him there than it had been in the labour camp. Kurt had a quick sense of humour and an interesting, inquisitive mind. With the natural optimism of his youth, he fully expected to go home. The von Wangenheims, another set of brothers from an old noble family, were also part of my group. The older brother, Konrad, had participated in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, in what was known as the 3-day event in horseback riding. During the cross-country ride, he had fallen and broken his collarbone, but he got back on his horse in spite of it and finished the event under terrible pain. Because that had assured his team the gold medal, he was a hero in Germany. Of course, the Russians were aware of all this. Our group also included the operations officer of General Feldmarschall von Paulus's 6th Army, which had surrendered at Stalingrad in February 1943. He was an Oberst in the General Staff. He was a quiet sort of person, and he suffered from his experience at Stalingrad. He was in his late 30s, about average in size, with dark hair and haunted eyes. In addition to the brutal combat with the Russians at Stalingrad, he had seen too many men die needlessly of starvation, of insufficient winter clothing, and of inadequate medical care because the 6th Army had not been allowed to retreat and could not be kept adequately supplied. He had completely given up on life, even though he had a wife and children at home, and he now just existed from one day to the next. We had a Catholic priest in our group, the one who ministered to the Radziwills. He was one of a group of chaplains who had cooperated with the Russians by writing articles and signing statements to the effect that a Christian could also be a communist. The Russians had sent the other chaplains who had done this to other camps after they had cooperated, but ours stayed at Krasnogorsk for some reason. We knew what he had done, but he was very congenial, and we accepted him. We had long discussions with him about why he had cooperated with the Russians. He was able to rationalize to himself that he needed to do whatever was necessary to stay alive in order to minister to the other prisoners. He also acknowledged that they could break him and force him to sign their statements, so he complied without forcing them to do so. He felt he was just being pragmatic. But a communist was an atheist by definition. How could an atheist also be a Christian? He also traded on the "we no longer have a country" theme that was common among German prisoners who cooperated with the Russians for better food and treatment. He was a survivor, a good talker, and very good at rationalizing whatever he wanted to justify. Hauptmann Arthur Pawelek, the former judge who was now our food master, was at Krasnogorsk because of his former influential job and his prominent family. The Russians especially feared such people because they might influence others against them. He was tall and slim, a nice person, friendly and supportive of everyone. He wanted to survive, and he wanted everyone else to survive, but he would not compromise his principles to do it. He took forceful issue with those who rationalized collaborating with the Russians because they no longer had a country. He felt strongly that since it was our generation that had helped to destroy Germany, it was our responsibility to rebuild it. He was generous with all of us whose homes were in East Germany, giving us his address in Bremen, West Germany, and offering to help all of us get a new start if we ever got out of Russia. Count von Schwerin was also a member of our group. Although he was more than 20 years older than I, we became close friends. With deep-set eyes, he quickly developed a gaunt look as he lost weight on our diet. He traded his cigarette ration for extra food, just as I did. The Russians treated the older civilian nobility like senior officers. They received a cigarette ration and did not have to work. He was a walker, walking kilometers every day around and around the camp. Except for the chaplain, these were close friends with whom I felt I could discuss anything. We had many long discussions on an endless number of topics. This ability to discuss things helped us maintain our sanity. It was one of the few weapons we had against the constant propaganda and the oppression and boredom of our situation. Once a week we got a bucket of warm water to take a bath with. We called that day Banya Day. Banya is the Russian word for bath, but for us it was a word for all the pleasant little things that we missed. When we had our Banya Day, we went into the bathhouse and got a tiny piece of soap, which had to last us a week, until our next Banya Day. The soap was a brownish substance that did not work very well. We got a wooden bucket that held perhaps 2 gallons of warm water. We took the bucket of water to a room where we undressed and washed. Then we rinsed off in a cold shower. We had small towels that we kept from one Banya Day to the next. We could have a bath only once a week because only so many people could go through the bathhouse in one day. Once a week for each of us was probably the most they could accommodate. As it was, we had to rush so everyone could get his turn. We also got a shave at the same place on our Banya Day. The Russians kept the razors locked up, of course, but we were shaved by a barber, a German prisoner, when we had our bath each week. Our haircuts amounted to being shaved bald with clippers from time to time. This, at least ostensibly, was to prevent lice. If one person had lice, they shaved everybody. It was an indignity at first, but we got used to it. I got someone who could sew to take the material of the red stripes from my pants and make me a skull cap like the Pope's, and whenever they shaved me bald, I wore the skull cap until my hair grew out again. The German activists did not like that because it was made from the red stripes of a general staff officer's trousers, but I did it in spite of them. Probably the worst aspect of prison life after the loss of freedom and the hunger was bedbugs, millions and millions of them. There were so many of them that they went right on biting in the daytime. There was no point in trying to kill them because there were so many. The biggest ones were almost as big as ladybugs. In the winter, when we were counted inside, we could see the bedbugs crawling on the bunk posts as we stood at attention. We finally persuaded the activists to mention it to the Russians. After that, we had to move out every 2 or 3 months so the Russians could fumigate the barracks and kill the bedbugs. Then for a few days we would have some relief, but the bedbugs would gradually begin to build up again. The Russians just could not get rid of the bedbugs completely, and for those prisoners who were allergic to bedbug bites, it was pure hell. During the worst times, some of the men would be literally covered with bites. I found a way to sleep without being bothered by them. I bought a horse blanket for 10 cigarettes and sewed it together like an envelope, with an opening toward the centre from both the top and the bottom. I would get into it so that the only opening at the centre was beneath me. It was difficult to breathe through the thick blanket, of course, but it was far better than getting bitten by bedbugs. We wore the clothes we had brought into captivity with us. I had my uniform with the riding pants, blouse and boots. I also had the long pants that our mechanized troops wore, which I had worn over my riding pants when I surrendered. Apart from that, I had 2 extra sets of underwear and 2 shirts. We had to take the badges of rank off our uniforms, and we were not allowed to wear any decorations. The Hague Convention would have allowed us to wear our decorations, but the Russians would not permit it because all the decorations had swastikas on them, and we understood their feelings about that. We did not feel that Stalin and communism were any improvement over Hitler and fascism, but we did not want to provoke them needlessly. At first, I had only my riding boots for shoes, so I wore my riding pants. Later, I bought a pair of homemade wooden-soled sandals, and then I wore the long pants and saved my boots and riding pants. The wooden shoes were just blocks of wood carved to the appropriate shape, like Dutch wooden shoes, with a strip of cloth across the top and nailed to the sides of the sole. They would hardly be good for marching, but they were adequate for our use in the camp. In the summer, we did not wear socks. We wore just the wooden-soled sandals and saved the socks for winter. The Russians provided no clothing at all in the beginning. Later, when ours had worn out, we received Russian army underwear, flannel-like long johns, but very primitive. Our underwear was laundered once a week by prisoners. We could not wash any clothing except underwear. In the winter, the Russians gave us old shirts and quilted jackets that had been worn out and discarded by the Russian army. We got them with patches, but they were at least washed, and they were warm. Russian shirts had no shape and no buttons. There were no buttons on any Russian army clothing. They were just straight down and short, with ribbons that tied. No German soldiers arrived at the prison camp with wounds that required medical attention. Those who had such wounds were treated in Germany before coming to the camp. Many people had old wounds. For example, several people could not walk without a cane, but nobody had open wounds. Fortunately, none of my wounds gave me any trouble. If someone got sick, the camp had a dispensary that was operated by German doctors and medical corpsmen who were prisoners. The Russians feared epidemics and tried to prevent them. We had regular delousings, and we had regular health inspections by the Russians every 3 months. The health inspections, however, amounted to nothing more than stripping naked and walking past a table behind which 3 Russian doctors sat. 2 of them were usually female doctors. They just looked us over to see if we seemed healthy. They would stop someone and question him only if he did not look right. Sometimes they would have us turn around, and sometimes they would even pinch us to see how much fat we had. If someone had a lot of bedbug bites, they would see that and be concerned about the possibility of a skin disease. Otherwise, the examination did not amount to much. From time to time, a Russian camp commander would try to force senior officers to work. However, we knew the number and the date of the order Stalin had signed, specifying that senior officers would not be forced to work, and whenever they tried to tell us we had to work, we quoted that order to them. The first time this happened, we were ordered outside to fall into formation. Then the camp commander told us we were going to work. We quoted the Stalin order to him, and he began shouting at us, "You are war criminals! You will do as you are ordered!" Then a German Oberst, who knew all the details of Stalin's order, quoted the order again in greater detail. The camp commander continued shouting for a while and then gave up. We suspected that he got so much money for every prisoner who worked. He could not force us to work in defiance of Stalin's order, but he could vent his spleen, and he did. Nobody was overworked in our camp, unlike the German prisoners in Russian labour camps, where senior officers were forced to work. Our people worked an 8-hour day, and for this they received a meal and 10 cigarettes. Those who worked never complained about it. If they worked in the forest, they could bring back wood and sell it to other prisoners in the camp. If they worked in the factories, they could steal things like small pieces of metal and plexiglass and sell them in the camp to people who could make useful things of them. They also made contacts with Russian workers in the factories to whom they could sell things that were made in the camp, such as cigarette cases, small picture frames, and chess sets, acting as middlemen between seller and buyer. They worked only 6 days a week. Sunday was not recognized as having any religious significance by the Russian government, but they recognized it as a day of rest. Those who did not work or stay occupied, those who just lay around and thought about food and home, began to deteriorate. Such prisoners would lose any capacity for generating or accepting ideas within months. Those of us who did not work occupied ourselves in a variety of ways. We had experts among us on every conceivable topic, theologians, diplomats, accountants, lawyers, writers, businessmen, so we would informally organize lectures. Someone would say, "Let's talk about horticulture," and a former professor of horticulture would lead a discussion about plants, flowers, trees, how and when to plant them, how to treat them, and so on. Other lectures were held in accounting, economics, history, and other subjects. Such discussion groups were scattered all around the camp, outside in the summer, inside in the winter. We had to keep the numbers small because the Russians, through the activists, would not allow large numbers of people to congregate. The activists kept everyone under close surveillance at all times because the Russians were always afraid of insurrection. We would sit in one of the bunk compartments, where there was room for 8, with 4 on one bunk facing 4 on the opposite bunk. Depending on our interests, we could join one of these study groups. We might have a series of lectures on one subject every Tuesday. Perhaps 10 to 15 lectures would occur during a day. Those of us who attended the lectures were able to keep our intellects sharp and acquire knowledge. The people who gave lectures did it to maintain their skills and knowledge. They lectured from memory, of course, because we had no textbooks. I continued my language studies, polishing my French and English and beginning to learn Spanish. I practiced my Italian with Italian prisoners. I even added some studies in law by attending the lectures by Hauptmann Pawelek, the former judge. We also played cards, although playing cards was supposedly decadent and forbidden. Cards were forbidden in the Russian army, so that ban was automatically extended to us. We got around it by telling them that our wooden cards were dominoes. They were not stupid enough to believe that, but they pretended to, because playing cards helped to keep us occupied and quiet. To make playing cards, we would buy thin plywood from those who worked in the factories. We made the cards about 2 by 4 centimetres. We would sand the plywood until it was smooth, with sandpaper stolen from the factories, then carve the numbers and symbols in the wood and colour them with red and black ink that was stolen from the offices by those who worked there. The cards would bend just a little, but they were too stiff to hold, so we made little stands the card players could put them on. We staged a bridge or chess tournament in the camp every few months. Although our chess tournaments were limited to the camp, so many nationalities were represented that we called them international tournaments. A tournament took several days, and each nation sent its best players. A Hungarian oberst and I played the final game in tournaments many times, and I was chess champion at Krasnogorsk during my whole time there. The Russians helped organize these tournaments because they loved chess and they wanted to keep us occupied. When an important Russian visitor came to visit the camp from Moscow, they would ask me to play a game of chess with him if they knew he was a chess player, as many Russians were. I always got some extra cigarettes and a cup of good tea for doing that, and it was usually quite friendly. Only one of them became angry and abusive when I beat him. Another way we occupied ourselves was by making things that we gave to one another as gifts at Christmas and on birthdays. We could buy wood from the prisoners who worked in the forest, and we could buy tin from those who worked in the kitchen. The Oscar Mayer cans, the Spam, came in, served us very well for many purposes. The prisoners who worked in the kitchen would get the cans because the Russians did not realize their value to us. The kitchen workers would then sell the metal to those who had handicraft skills. We used the cans not only for material, but also for blades for carving knives. The Russians allowed us to have small carving knives. The blades were too small to constitute a dangerous weapon. To make a knife, we would cut a piece of metal into a small triangle, put it into a wooden handle, and then sharpen it on a piece of rock. People carved chess sets, cigarette boxes, and things like that. One prisoner even made clocks, with all the wheels and gears made of tin from Oscar Mayer cans. We called them Oscar Mayer clocks. The people who were good at crafts could make such things, and prisoners who worked in Russian factories could take them to the factories and sell them to the Russian workers on commission. I still have a fold-out set of picture frames and a carved cigarette case that were given to me as gifts, and an aluminum cigarette case that I won for being chess champion. There was no reason for us to be bored. Some people put enormous psychological pressure on themselves by just lying around all day thinking about food and living from meal to meal. We were all always hungry, but I kept my time filled, so there was no time to brood about it. I tried to keep myself occupied with studies and lectures, with crafts, with music, and with bridge and chess. All this may sound like fun and a good time, but it was really just a desperate attempt to survive and not give up. Even though this prison routine continued for nearly 5 years, I refused to allow it to become boring. Only when I thought about home did things get really bad for me. Otherwise, my days were filled, and I kept myself occupied. When I felt myself becoming depressed, I had only to remind myself of all the other German soldiers of all ranks who were being worked to death in the brutal labour camps. I had always been athletic, and I established an exercise routine for myself. In summer, I would walk throughout the camp for an hour, and then I would do calisthenics for 30 minutes. In the coldest part of winter, I would suspend the walking and just do the calisthenics. Many others did various kinds of exercises also. Our limited diet made us tire quickly, and for this reason some people did not exercise, but I did all right with the extra food I was able to buy with my cigarettes. Paper was of tremendous value in the camp. It was not just in short supply, it was practically non-existent. Even the Russians did not have it. When they counted us, they marked the numbers on a small wooden board, because they did not have paper. Then, after the numbers tallied and had been reported, they scraped the numbers off with a knife and used the board again. Sometimes, when cigarettes were scarce, we got Red Star Macorka tobacco instead. But of course we had no cigarette paper. The only people among the prisoners who could get newspapers were the activists and those who worked as translators. The newspaper was intentionally made so it could double as cigarette paper. The translators were allowed to read the Russian newspapers Pravda and Izvestia, so they had paper they could use to roll cigarettes. The activists and translators would share their newspaper with friends, but others would have to buy it from them or try to fashion pipes for their tobacco. One page of newspaper was worth 600 grams of bread. The only other paper we ever got was the paper the tobacco came in, and it was almost more precious than the tobacco. If our group was 12 people, we would divide the paper into 6 pieces and take turns getting it. We kept a list so that nobody was left out. The paper was too thick to roll cigarettes in, but it was workable for writing. It was white with a red star and a hammer and sickle on it. Time was different in the prison camp from in the outside world. To a large degree, time conditioned and ruled the outside world, whereas in the camp time had no meaning at all. Units of time like a day, a week, or a month were meaningless, because nothing was happening and nobody was going anywhere. Except for Sunday, when no one marched off to work, every day was like every other day. Our routine was carefully organized. Our food was distributed at the same time every day, and in the monotonous void of our daily lives, the meals, as bad as they were, afforded certain stimulus for the eye and the brain. In May 1946, exactly 1 year after I had surrendered in Berlin, the Russians finally permitted us to write home. I was permitted to write a postcard, with another postcard attached to it for an answer. I was allowed only 15 words in my postcard, and Lilo was allowed only 15 words in her response. I wrote that I was well and healthy. Waiting and hoping for a reply was sheer agony. Finally, after more than 2 months, I got Lilo's reply on July 24th. It was a day sent by heaven. Only when I received it did I know for certain that she and Klaus had survived the war. She knew that I was alive, because the old retired general who had been released from the gentleman's prison in Köpenick delivered the letter I had written her from there. Lilo wrote that she and Klaus were well, and that we had a second son, whom she had named Alexander, and who had been born exactly 1 year earlier, July 24th, 1945. She had sewn a photograph of her and our sons onto the back of the postcard, and I blessed her for her ingenuity. Receiving that photograph was like getting a new lease on life. I still had a small oval locket with a picture of Lilo that I had saved through countless searches by Russian guards. When I received the postcard featuring the new family portrait, I carefully trimmed it to fit and placed it on the opposite side of the locket. Throughout the remainder of my captivity, the locket remained close around my neck. The joy of learning that my family was alive was swiftly dampened as my gaze fell upon the barbed wire separating us. Their existence only intensified my longing for them. Until then, I had been bracing myself against the possibility of their demise in the war. My survival had been about enduring each moment to reach the next. Now I had a reason to strive beyond mere survival. Each day had previously felt like a small miracle and a gift. Now, with the knowledge of my family awaiting me, every day became even more precious. From May 1946 onwards, we were permitted to exchange postcards with our wives twice a year, and I would earn an additional postcard as a prize in our chess tournaments. Winning became a motive driven by the desire to receive these postcards. However, during times of tension in the Cold War, the Russians would withhold our return postcards, leaving us uncertain if we would ever receive them. The uncertainty of whether I would see Lilo and our sons again was the most agonizing aspect of my captivity. At times, the Russians would declare, "You are war criminals. You will never return home." Then, when their fortunes improved in the Cold War, they would assure us we'd be home by Christmas. Their psychological games sometimes wore me down, but I eventually adopted the philosophy of the Russian peasant. Tomorrow will be better. This mindset helped me accept the uncertainties of captivity and taught me the value of patience, a lesson that proved invaluable throughout my life. Patience, I realized, was also a trait of the Russian peasants, and now I understood why. Throughout our imprisonment, the Russians interrogated us regularly. A guard would escort us to the administration building for questioning. During these sessions, they would inquire about our military units, actions, and whereabouts. They possessed detailed knowledge of our military structure and events. Those who had been involved in actions resulting in civilian casualties faced severe treatment. My interrogations differed initially due to my role as operations officer of the 56th Panzer Corps during the defence of Berlin, and my presence in the Führer headquarters bunker at war's end. The Russians sought precise details about the events in Berlin and were interested in German military tactics and plans, including rumours of underground resistance. Colonel Stern, my primary interrogator at Krasnogorsk, was a refined and educated man, distinct from the camp officers. During our conversations, he broached sensitive topics, including Auschwitz, highlighting the atrocities committed there. His interrogation tactics delved deep into war crimes and partisan activities, revealing his contempt for those involved. After all, you were right there at Führer headquarters. I was sure that this obvious lie was a trick of some kind. What he was saying could not possibly be true, but I decided to play along with him until I found out what he was up to. "I had time for nothing but combat in Berlin," I said. "There was not even adequate time for that." Although it was not easy, I eventually convinced him that I had no knowledge of Auschwitz or any other extermination camps. "But you knew about the concentration camps?" he asked finally. "Yes, I knew of Dachau as a place where the government detained political agitators, Jews and homosexuals. This was reported in the newspapers, but nothing about people being put to death." After that, Stern never raised the subject again. He asked me very specific questions about military events in Berlin. I never had any really unpleasant encounters during my interrogations. He never took notes, so I was sure he was after just small bits of information. He was curious about dates, about the fighting between the Oder River and Berlin, about the fighting in Berlin, and who the commanders were. After I convinced him that I knew nothing about the death camps, the questions he asked concerned only military history. After my interrogators had satisfied themselves about what had happened in Berlin, they wanted to know about the fighting in Russia in 1941. They wanted to know where I was, when, and with which units. They were also very interested in knowing whether any Russians had cooperated with us. Of course, many Russians behind our front worked for us in hospitals, supply depots, and the like. The Russians always wanted to get their names, but they knew I was always at the front when I was in Russia, and they always dropped it when I said I had never known any.